Speak, Lord, for your servants are listening. Amen.
Amen.
So when we last left, it looked like David basically had the whole country in its pocket, in his pocket pretty much. All of his enemies have been murdered, which is, rough for them. And David didn't ask for that to happen, but now that it has, he's in a pretty good position. So, any thoughts or questions about what we were up to previously before we carry on?
No.
All right. Could I get you to read up to verse 5?
Okay. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, You shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years.
All right. So David is finally officially king of all Israel. And so we can see that there must have been some sort of politicking or waiting or something at some point, because Ishbosheth only reigned for 2 years, but David reigned for 7 years in Hebron. So on one side of Ishbosheth's reign or the other, there was a little bit of something going on, but eventually they'll sort of come to their senses and say, hey, remember when Saul was king and David was a great military leader and did all that great stuff?
Mm-hmm.
And also remember how, God promised that he was going to be king over Israel. Maybe he should be king. All right. So now perhaps he needs a new capital, perhaps maybe something a bit more centrally located. Maybe. We'll see. Can I get you to read up to verse 10?
Okay. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off," thinking, "David cannot come in here." Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. And David said on that day, "Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul." Therefore it is said, "The blind and the lame shall not come into the house." And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from the Millo inward. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him.
So David has taken the city formerly known as Jebus and now known as Jerusalem, and he has turned it into his capital, which makes sense for a variety of reasons. Most importantly, because it is right on the border with Benjamin. And so both for diplomatic reasons and perhaps for keeping an eye on them reasons, it's a good place to be. And also because Judah is in the south of Israel, by having his capital on the northern border of Judah, he is by extension closer to every other tribe as well. Was Michelle talking to somebody else, or?
Yes, it's okay. Amy just came in for a second. Yeah.
So he's got that going for it. Now, Jerusalem is, of course, originally, well, maybe not originally. I'm not exactly sure how old Jerusalem is as a city, but famously in the book of Genesis, it is the city of Melchizedek. king of Salem. And so at one point, it belonged to people who worshiped the Lord, but as God said to Abraham, the sin of the Canaanites has not reached its peak, and so later your descendants will return, but for now, we'll keep going, I guess. So evidently, in between the time of Abraham and now, things have gone pretty south for the city, as well as the Canaanites in general. That being said, David takes the city, but we'll see quickly that a lot of the Jebusites are still in the city and still live there.
Peacefully?
Well, I mean, relatively. I mean, it depends how peaceful is. But for example, the threshing floor that David eventually buys in order to put the temple there belonged to Ornan the Jebusite. So, I mean, he pays for it instead of just taking it from him. So that's something, I guess. Now, obviously, when they say the lame, the blind, who are hated by David's soul, what he's not saying is he literally hates everybody who's lame and blind, but rather than that, facetiously, the people that are preventing David from getting into the city. Yes. Yeah, and so David builds the city all around. So I guess that's building fortifications, and he becomes greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. Can we go on to verse 16?
Okay. And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees, also carpenters and masons, who built David a house. And David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. And David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. And these are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhiah, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. That's not that many kids.
Yeah, it's not that many.
Yeah, I don't know how many wives he had, but
I mean,
11.
These are probably, well, actually, I'm not sure. Some of these might be daughters. But you can always tell, as an English speaker, you can always tell when somebody in a list of names is going to be important, because it's a name you can actually pronounce.
Okay, like Nathan and Solomon.
Yeah, because it's like, if somebody's in the Bible and they're not very important, then nobody names their kids after them, and so you've never pronounced the name before.
Still, 11 kids. Is it? I wonder if they're purposefully not naming them all, or is that all of them?
Well, I mean, there's, I don't know, a couple of ways to think about this. On one hand, maybe these were just the ones that survived and made some sort of name for themselves.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Maybe these are just the sons and they're not listing any of the daughters. Or maybe since a lot of these were political marriages, David only had like one child with some of them.
Okay.
Those are my suspicions. At one point, I was trying to figure out if the Nathan that's mentioned here is the prophet Nathan that we hear about later.
Yeah.
I don't think it is. I just don't think the timeline works out quite right. In order for that Nathan to be the right Nathan, then when he confronts David about his adultery, he'd have to be like 14 years old tops. Like the timeline doesn't really work.
Okay, but wait a minute. Supposing it turns out that David and Bathsheba happened when like David was in his 60s. I don't know.
Well, I looked into it, and the issue is that, okay, so David lived until he was 70 years old.
Oh, that's it? He only lived to 70?
Yeah, because he was 30 when he became king, and then he reigned for 40 years. So David lived until he was 70.
So he died, in other words, he died at the end of his reign? Is that how it works?
Yeah, presumably.
70, okay.
Yeah, because you didn't really retire back then. You kind of just kept going until you died. I mean,
Okay.
sometimes they do like a co-reigning thing where like the father and the son would be on the throne at the same time,
Okay.
and the father would sort of teach the son the ropes until he kicked
I
the
mean,
bucket, and the son would
biblically
take over.
speaking, 70 years is not very much. It's not very long.
Well, I mean, we're no longer in the book of Genesis where people can just
Yeah.
kind of keep on going for a
Yeah.
long old time.
Yeah.
Now, I will say that there are some people, even after the book of Genesis, who do live for a while, you know, like Moses lives for 120 years, Joshua lives for 110 years.
Yeah.
But as I believe one of the Psalms says, you know, the days of our life are 70 years, or perhaps by reason of strength, 80.
Mhm.
And so around this time period, you know, living to 70 would have been, you know, pretty good.
Mhm.
And that's another thing, to look at it from the other perspective. You know, sometimes you hear like, oh, life expectancy was like 35 years old in the Middle Ages or something.
Mhm.
That doesn't take into account the fact that like, if you live past childhood, you live for a lot longer than that. Because, you
Yeah.
know, low life expectancies usually aren't like about how old somebody can get. It's about how likely you are to become an adult in the first
Yeah.
place.
Yeah. Because most people died in childhood, eh? Like a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah,
big
well,
stuff.
most of them as like infants, and then, you know, once you make it to age 5, you're
Mm.
pretty much good, more or less. I mean, you know, you might die in a war or something, but I mean, aside from that, they
Mhm.
probably, you know, could live, you know, almost as long as we could now. It's just, you know, how likely is it?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
So,
But
yeah.
it was an important, yeah.
Yeah. So basically, what I was saying is that David lived until he was 70, and then we know that Solomon had at least Solomon had already fathered Rehoboam by the time Solomon became king. So that means that Solomon had to have been at least like probably 16, you know, at least, which means that if Nathan was also born while David was in Jerusalem, then the oldest Nathan could have been, would have been, you know, like mid-teens.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, it seems that we can presume perhaps that at least some of these marriages were more political marriages, which again, we were warned against in the book of Deuteronomy. At least one of these is in fact not a political marriage, as we're aware. David and Bathsheba was not a political marriage. Well, I mean, it's a political marriage insofar as they messed up, and if David was held accountable for it, it would have been really bad for him politically. So in that sense, I suppose it's a political marriage. But obviously, not all of these children have actually been born yet in the narrative as we're going, because you know, David and Bathsheba is not for another 7 chapters or so.
Mm-hmm.
So will we carry on to verse 21?
To 21, okay. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. But David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand. And David came to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. And he said, the Lord has broken through my enemies before me like a breaking flood. Therefore the name of that place is called Baal Perazim. And the Philistines left their idols there, and David and his men carried them away.
All right. So I meant to do a little bit more research into this, and I haven't yet. But I think that the Valley of Rephaim might be at least sort of like the Valley of the Shadow of Death. The Rephaim seem to have some sort of connection to like the giants, but also possibly to like dead spirits. I need to look into that some more at some point, but I think that there might be a connection there. And so Baal Perazim means like Lord of bursting through or Lord of breaking forth or something like that. And so this is another example of like old-timey Israelites being allowed to use the word Baal before it becomes too associated with specific Canaanite deities.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the obvious question, or at least the obvious question to ancient Israelites is, what on earth does it mean that the Philistines left their idols there and David and his men carried them away?
Yeah.
So on one hand, you could say that from a purely literary perspective, this is the exact opposite of what happened in 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel, the Israelites fought the Philistines, and then the Ark of the Covenant got taken away.
Yeah.
And in this time, David and the Israelites fight the Philistines, and they win, and they take the idols of the Philistines away. Now, this is kind of just standard, like ancient, not necessarily specifically pagan, but generally pagan practices. You know, when you beat somebody, you get their gods in one way or another. That is, you take them away and either like, this belongs to me now, or in some cases, like actually serving them, which seems like weird and counterintuitive.
Mm-hmm.
But for example, when Babylon was destroyed, as far as we know, it seems like Cyrus performed the rites of Marduk in Babylon after he conquered Babylon. I think the idea is that like, oh, we've conquered this place, and now, you know, we're gonna I don't know, appease the local deities or whatever. Now, I don't think that that's what David's doing. The reason that I don't think that's what David's doing is because this question was a question that evidently early Israelites were also asking, because in First Chronicles, when they're telling the same story, they elaborate a bit more. So it says, and he went up to Baal Perazim, and David struck them down there, and David said, God has broken through my enemies by my hand like a bursting flood. Therefore, the name of that place is called Baal Perazim. And they left their gods there, and David gave command, and they were burned. It appears that what happened was that in 2 Samuel, the emphasis is on David and his men taking the gods away, as in like, we got you, we got them, you know, we're taking them away from you. But then in Book of Chronicles, they elaborate a bit more and say that after they took them, they were burned.
They were. Mm-hmm. Which means they were probably made of wood?
Presumably. I mean, if you're gonna bring idols with you while you're fighting, yeah. You know, I'd want them to be made out of wood.
Yeah, yeah.
Sounds a lot easier.
So they were kind of like bringing him like a rabbit's foot talisman or whatever, thinking it would help them.
Yeah, I think that they were using them in much the same way that the Israelites were trying to use the Ark of the Covenant in 1 Samuel. Yeah, okay. It was sort of like, well, if we bring them with us, then they're gonna make sure some sort of deal. All right. Can I get you to read to the end of the chapter?
Mm-hmm. And the Philistines came up yet again and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And when David inquired of the Lord, he said, you shall not go up. Go around to their rear and come against them opposite the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then rouse yourself. For then the Lord has gone out before you to strike down the enemy of the Philistines. And David did as the Lord commanded him and struck down the Philistines from Geba to Gezer.
All right.
So they came back again.
Wow. Yeah, interesting. When the Ark of the Covenant was taken, the Ark sort of affected its own rescue mission, but perhaps they were trying to do a little bit of a rescue mission of their own, and it did not work for them. So I think we can see that the Philistines, at least some of them, who previously considered themselves allies of Israel, or at least allies of David, no longer considered themselves allies of David after he, took the throne of all Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it seems that he has fairly soundly defeated them. When is the next time we actually hear about the Philistines? Because I feel like after this point, they don't come up that often. Hmm. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so yeah, after this point, the Philistines are not mentioned again, except in the context of stories that happened previously. So I'm not saying that the Philistines just stopped existing after this point, but they're no longer a problem for David as far as he's concerned,
Mm-hmm.
and as far as Israel is concerned, at least in terms of being a large enough problem that it actually makes it into the Bible. So, speaking of the Ark of the Covenant, where is that anyways? Where do we leave that? What's it been up to?
Yeah.
Well, that's what David's thinking, I think. Can I get you to read up to verse 4?
Okay, hang on. 4. Okay. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baale Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark.
All right, so a lot going on here. We've got Baal Judah, which means the lords of Judah. This is also, as far as we can tell, the same city as Kiriath Jearim. Places change names, I guess.
Yeah.
Now, we have a bit of a warning here, perhaps. The Ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who is seated on the cherubim. I'm just going to look up when was the last time that we saw that phrase. Bible Gateway, I think we have seen that phrase before, so if you could actually show it to me, that would be nice. Yeah, that's what I thought. Yes, okay. So the last time that we were reminded that the Ark of the Covenant is associated with the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim, that was in 1 Samuel chapter 4, right before the sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died in battle and lost the Ark of the Covenant. So I sure hope that the Ark of the Covenant is being treated respectfully this time and not doing anything foolish. So they've decided to put it on a cart. That's interesting. A new cart. So that's good. It hasn't been used before. So nice and symbolic, I suppose. But that's not how they're supposed to be carrying the ark, actually. The ark actually comes conveniently with little loops on the sides that you can put poles through and then carry it on your shoulders. And so it is not being moved the way that God commanded. So hopefully nothing bad happens. Can I get you to read up to verse 11?
Okay. And David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error. And he died there beside the ark of God. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah. And that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household.
Well, who could have seen this coming? Removing the most holy item in the entire Israelite religion, and then you touch it at an inopportune time, and you are struck down and killed. Just earlier, we had Baal Perazim, Lord of Bursting Forth, and now we have Perez Uzzah breaking out against Uzzah. And so, where does the ark Lord?
Makes you wonder if there's something else about Uzzah that we don't know, because it seems awfully harsh to strike him down when he was trying to keep it from falling off the cart, you know.
Well, on one hand, it does seem awfully harsh, but on the other hand, this is what bad liturgy gets you. I don't know. Now, later in the same chapter, we're going to see that perhaps sometimes we have weird ideas about the liturgy that are actually just us being grumpy, perhaps. But right now, whereas the Ark of the Covenant ended up in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, that is somebody from Gath. So right back to the Philistines.
And they were blessed for having it.
Yeah, well, I guess they were treating it respectfully. I may have mentioned before, the name Obed-Edom the Gittite is about the most non-Israelite name that you could possibly get, because not only is he from Gath, but he's also the servant of Edom. That's what Obed-Edom means. And yet the Ark of the Lord has come to him, and he is treating it very respectfully, it seems, and the Lord is blessing him. We also have this interesting phrase, how can the Ark of the Lord come to me? Which is sort of reflected in the New Testament when Elizabeth says to Mary, and how can the mother of my Lord come to me? But in that case, it is said in the context of joy, not of sheer terror. And so there's, I think there is perhaps even a sort of stereotypically Lutheran sermon gotten out of this, which is that Uzzah sort of looked at the situation that was happening, in which the Ark of the Covenant was, from his perspective, about to fall and land on the ground, and thought to himself, I'm going to help God. That's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to reach out and do God a favor by making sure that the Ark of the Covenant does not fall on the ground. And perhaps this is a lesson to us all, that when we think that we are going to, by our own works and efforts, do God a favor, that perhaps we are approaching things the wrong way, that perhaps God is going to be fine, and we should try to receive the benefits that he has promised through his word, rather than try and give it a little assist that he has not asked for. But perhaps God will use the benefits that he is giving the Gentiles in order to drive the Israelites towards some sort of jealousy, to borrow a concept from the Apostle Paul. So can you read up to verse 15?
Okay. And it was told King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. And David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn.
All right. So we're going back, and we're doing it right this time, it seems. And David is wearing a linen ephod, which is some sort of priestly garment. There does seem to be a sort of interesting something going on here, in which David and his descendants sort of seem to be sort of priests in some way. But it's very interesting and weird way, because later in a couple of chapters, it'll say that David's sons were priests. But yet, there must be more to this story, because we also know that one of the kings of Judah, several generations from now, will burst into the temple and say, I'm going to offer incense, and it does not go well for him. So this doesn't seem to be something that is happening just because he's king, or even just because he's David, or because his sons are sons of David. There seems to be perhaps something else going on there as well. Perhaps they've been consecrated to do so. I mean, we don't necessarily know that. Well, actually, David's going to look more like a priest in a couple of verses, so maybe not so. We go up to verse 19.
Okay. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his house.
And so we come back to the descendants of Saul. And things are just not going so well for them. Michal is back with David, but I don't think that she likes him very much.
No.
Meanwhile, David has pitched a tent. I do not think actually that this is the tabernacle. I think this is just a tent.
Okay.
The reason that I suggest this is that, as far as we know, the Ark of the Covenant does not leave Jerusalem for a while after this moment. And yet, we know that at the beginning of Solomon's reign, the tabernacle is somewhere else.
But look at verse 17. It says, and they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it.
Yeah. I guess the question is, but is that the tabernacle?
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a tent, and it is, in some sense, its place. I guess the question is it its place because that's where they were going to put it, or is it its place because that's the place in a tabernacle where it's supposed to be? But we do know that at the beginning of Solomon's reign, the tabernacle is in a different city. So whether that's because at some point they take all this stuff and move it somewhere else, or for some other reason, I don't know. It seems that there is still some additional consolidation to be done in some way, perhaps. Now it says that David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. It often says this about kings. It's not entirely clear whether he literally did that or whether he just ensured that it was done. Okay. But he does, in fact, bless the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, which might be the Aaronic blessing, perhaps, and gives them all food, and they eat it, and they all go home. So it's a nice meal before the Lord of hosts, and then they all go home.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder what David's going to return home to.
Mm-hmm.
You go until the end of the chapter.
Okay. And David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel honored himself today. uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death.
So we've got a couple of questions here. One is, was David naked?
Yeah.
Now, David was wearing an ephod.
Right.
I'm not an expert enough to know how much of your body an ephod would cover. Particularly, the question is, how much does that actually imply? Like, in the sense that, like, if I told you that somebody was out there wearing a stole, you would assume that, like, he was also wearing other stuff as well,
Yeah, right.
And so that's one question, is that, Michal is maybe, mad at him, not because he was, literally naked, but maybe because he was not wearing something that she thought he should be wearing.
Okay, it could
Perhaps, or perhaps simply because he is acting in a way that is less dignified than he should be.
Yeah.
I mean, because the things that
since he was dancing like crazy and everything, I mean, he obviously wasn't wearing his kingly robes,
Yeah,
So.
at the very least, he was not dressed in the metaphorical garb of, dignity.
Yeah.
And so this is something to think about, I suppose. It is very common, I think, for a lot of Europeans and people of European descent to assume that being reverent is the same thing as just not moving, just like being as calm and collected as humanly possible.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that necessarily that's like wrong, but it is perhaps something to think about, that like it is possible to be reverent and also move around at the same time. Now, perhaps David was maybe a bit too exuberant. I don't know. He's very excited about finally having the Ark of the Lord in his city.
Is Michal the one that Saul married off to somebody else, and then after that David grabbed her back, took her back, and then her husband was crying? Oh, no wonder she's pissed.
Yeah, I mean, things have not gone very well for her. She was married off to David, presumably in order to make sure that David would be pacified and not try to make a move on the throne of Israel. And then Michal loved David. This is one of the few times actually that we hear about. Like, I'm pretty sure that the scriptures specifically say that she loved him, and it's one of the few times actually in the Bible that we hear about a woman loving a man or a man loving a woman, like specifically that actual verb. And so she like lets him out of the window in order for him to escape, and he just leaves her there, and she gets married off to somebody else, and then he brings her back, and then I don't know, she's a little bit upset. Now, one of the questions is, why doesn't Michal have a child to the day of her death? Is it because she was cursed by the Lord? Like, did the Lord close her womb, or was her relationship with David soured such that they just never had children?
That's what I'm wondering.
It does not say. But we see here, I don't know, a sort of sad story of one of the less happy parts of David's life, perhaps. But on the positive side, David has established a city for himself and presumably for the worship of the Lord as well. The Ark of the Covenant is there. Next chapter, he's going to start thinking, maybe I've got a house, so maybe God should have a house as well.
Mhm.
The king of Tyre gave him all that wood for his own house. That's another funny thing, is that like, it's like David's got a house made out of wood. And it's like, oh, very fancy house made out of wood.
Yeah.
Because presumably at the time, most houses would be made of like clay, I guess.
Cow patties.
Yeah.
Like in India.
I don't know, maybe. Now, this is perhaps another reason why a lot of stuff from David's time specifically doesn't leave us a whole lot of archaeological evidence, because if his house is made of wood, what's going to be left now?
Yeah.
But I believe that Solomon's palace gets called the House of the Forest of Lebanon, so lots of wood there.
Mhm.
All right, so I'm going to read a psalm here to wrap things up. Is there any questions or thoughts or anything that you wanted to think about before?
No, go ahead.
All right, so this is Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein, for he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false, and does not swear deceitfully. He will receive blessing from the Lord, and righteousness from the God of his salvation. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of the God of Jacob. Lift up your head, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. It's one of those really interesting psalms where, like, the situation in David's life in which this psalm was written is pretty obvious, and it also has like very clear like Christological associations. Like, this is the psalm that we usually sing, I believe, at Ascension usually, I think.
Matching. Yeah.
So sort of shows, kind of what the point of the Old Testament is in a lot of ways, to just sort of like be this mirror of what eventually comes in the New Testament.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well, with that, I will stop recording.